What if I told you that every financial decision affecting your life right now, your salary, your rent, the price of groceries, whether you can afford a house, wasn't decided by the politicians you voted for? What if the real power wasn't in the White House or Parliament or any government building you've ever seen? What if I told you there are rooms where your economic future gets written and you'll never be invited inside? If you want to understand who really controls your money, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to discover will change how you see everything. Welcome back to Monetary Archaeologist, where we dig up the financial secrets they never taught you in school. Let me ask you something. When gas prices explode overnight, who decided that? When interest rates suddenly jump and your mortgage becomes unaffordable, who made that call? When your government announces necessary economic reforms that somehow always benefit the wealthy, where did that idea come from? You probably think it's your elected leaders making these choices. But here's the truth that'll make your skin crawl. Most of the economic policies that control your daily life were never debated in public. They weren't voted on. They weren't even created by people you elected. They came from somewhere else entirely. They came from think tanks. Now, I know what you're thinking. Think tanks? Those boring policy groups? Come on. But stick with me, because this rabbit hole goes deeper than you can imagine. Let's rewind to 1916. World War I is tearing Europe apart. The global economy is in chaos. Governments are scrambling, trying to figure out how to manage money, debt, war production, and international trade. Here's the problem. Most governments back then didn't have economists on staff. They didn't have policy experts. They were flying blind. So a group of wealthy philanthropists and academics in Washington had an idea. What if they created a permanent organization, independent from government, that would study economic problems and tell politicians what to do? They called it the Brookings Institution. On paper, it looked innocent, just smart people doing research, right? But here's what actually happened. Brookings immediately became the invisible hand guiding American economic policy. Their reports shaped federal budgets, wartime production, taxation models, and monetary policy. Politicians didn't have to think anymore. They just asked Brookings what to do. And Brookings told them. This created a blueprint that would change the world forever. Private organizations funded by wealthy donors controlling public policy. And it spread like wildfire. In London, after World War I collapsed the old world order, British elites created their own version, Chatham House. Officially called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House brought together politicians, bankers, diplomats, and scholars behind closed doors to discuss the future of the global economy. Notice the pattern? Closed doors, private funding, public influence. By the time World War II ended, these organizations weren't just advising governments anymore, they were the government's brain. Then came something even more powerful. In 1948, the United States government teamed up with private donors to create RAND Corporation. RAND wasn't like the others, it was a hybrid monster. Part academic research center, part military intelligence operation, part future prediction machine. RAND didn't just study economics, they engineered it. Nuclear strategy, game theory, behavioral psychology, computer modeling, risk assessment, war simulations. RAND built the intellectual framework for how America would fight the Cold War and manage its economy for the next 50 years. And every major think tank that came after copied RAND's model. By the 1970s, think tanks were everywhere. The Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Peterson Institute, Carnegie, Hoover, hundreds of them, all competing for one thing: the power to control what ideas become reality. Here's something most people never realize. Politicians come and go. Presidents serve 4 or 8 years. Legislatures flip every election cycle. But think tanks, they're permanent. They don't care who wins elections because they influence everyone. Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, doesn't matter. Because while you're voting for personalities, think tanks are writing the rule book that all politicians follow. Let me show you how this works. Imagine you're a newly elected leader. You've got big ideas, you want to fix the economy, help working people, make real change. Day one, your advisors hand you a stack of reports from major think tanks. Mr. President, according to Brookings, we need to reduce the deficit. Madam Prime Minister, the Peterson Institute says we must cut spending. The Heritage Foundation warns that raising taxes will destroy growth. Suddenly, your ideas don't matter anymore, because the experts have already decided what's possible and what's irresponsible. And if you go against them, the media, who also rely on think tank experts, will destroy you.
This is how modern power actually works. Not through force, not through laws, through consensus manufacturing. Now here's where it gets really ugly. Think tanks don't run on air. They need funding. So who pays for them? Corporations, billionaires, defense contractors, oil companies, Wall Street banks, tech giants, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Goldman Sachs, Lockheed Martin, ExxonMobil, Google, every major industry with something to gain. Now, they'll tell you these donations come with no strings attached. They'll swear up and down that their research is independent. But let me ask you this. When was the last time a think tank funded by oil companies published a report saying we should immediately ban fossil fuels? When was the last time a think tank funded by Wall Street recommended breaking up big banks? When was the last time a defense contractor-funded think tank said we should slash military spending? Never. It never happens. Because think tanks don't need to be told what to say. The money just flows to organizations that already agree with the donors. That's how influence works at the highest level, not through commands, but through alignment. The economic worldview factory. Let me take you back to the 1980s. Suddenly, out of nowhere, every major government in the Western world started saying the same thing. We need deregulation. We need tax cuts for corporations. We need to privatize public services. We need to let the free market run wild. Reagan said it. Thatcher said it. Leaders across Europe said it. Was this a coincidence? No. This was the result of a coordinated, decades-long campaign by think tanks funded by corporations who wanted exactly those policies. The Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, all pumping out report after report after report promoting deregulation and tax cuts. And the media treated these reports like gospel truth. Within a decade, the entire Western economic system had been restructured. Not because voters demanded it, not because it was proven to work, but because think tanks manufactured a consensus that made it seem inevitable. The same thing happened with globalization. In the 1990s, suddenly everyone agreed. Free trade is good. Borders are outdated. Global corporations should move money and jobs wherever they want. Where did this idea come from? Think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, and the Peterson Institute, all funded by multinational corporations and billionaires who profited massively from globalization. They didn't force anyone to believe it. They just made it the smart position. And anyone who disagreed was labeled protectionist or economically illiterate. This is how you control an entire civilization, not by changing laws, but by changing what people think is possible. The revolving door. But here's the scariest part. The same people rotate between think tanks, government positions, and corporate boardrooms. Someone works at Goldman Sachs for 5 years. Then they take a position at Brookings. Then they get appointed to the Treasury Department. Then they go back to a think tank as a senior fellow. Then they get appointed to regulate the very industry they used to work for. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is public record. And it creates something incredibly powerful. Ideological continuity. It doesn't matter who wins the election. The same people with the same ideas stay in power behind the scenes. This is why economic policy barely changes no matter who's president. This is why financial crises keep happening the same way. This is why the system feels rigged. because the people writing the rules never change. The perception machine. Think tanks don't just influence policy, they influence how you think about money. Let me show you how. A respected think tank publishes a report. National debt crisis looms. Within hours, every news network is talking about it. Politicians start giving speeches about it. Investors panic and pull money out of certain markets. Central banks react to calm the markets. And suddenly, an idea that started in a private conference room with 10 people becomes national policy affecting millions. This is modern economic power. The ability to turn analysis into anxiety and anxiety into action. When think tanks say inflation is coming, markets react. When they say we need austerity, governments cut spending. When they say we need deregulation, industries get freed from oversight. They don't need votes. They don't need public approval. They just need credibility. And credibility, my friends, is the most stable currency in the world. The Chicago Revolution. Let me tell you about one of the most successful think tank operations in history. In the mid-1900s, a group of economists at the University of Chicago, led by Milton Friedman, started pushing a radical idea. Governments are the problem. Free markets are the solution. Deregulate everything.
This wasn't just academic theory. With support from think tanks like the Hoover Institution and the American Enterprise Institute, these ideas became the foundation of economic policy worldwide. Reaganomics, Thatcherism, the Washington Consensus that restructured entire continents. Countries across Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe reorganized their entire economies based on frameworks created in think tank conference rooms. Not through democratic debate, through intellectual manufacturing. Entire nations restructured based on ideas that were never voted on. The global consensus factory. Then there's Davos, the World Economic Forum. Every year, the most powerful people on Earth gather in a Swiss ski resort. CEOs, central bankers, presidents, billionaires. They don't pass laws there. They don't vote on anything. But they create something far more powerful: alignment. When these people agree on what the future should look like, capital flows in that direction. When capital flows, governments follow. When governments follow, your life changes. That's how climate policy gets shaped. That's how digital currency conversations start. That's how stakeholder capitalism becomes the new buzzword. Not through democracy, but through elite consensus. The echo chamber of truth. Here's the most brilliant part of the whole system. Think tanks cite each other. A Brookings report gets quoted by Chatham House. A RAND study gets used by NATO. A Peterson Institute analysis appears in a White House briefing. A Council on Foreign Relations paper gets cited by the IMF. Over and over and over. Until it stops being one organization's opinion and starts looking like universal truth. When enough prestigious institutions agree, disagreement becomes impossible. This creates a closed loop. Think tanks create ideas. Ideas shape elite consensus. Consensus becomes market expectation. Expectation shapes policy. Policy reinforces the original ideas. The cycle is self-sustaining, and the public never gets a seat at the table. Central banks, the final fortress. Central banks are supposed to be independent, right? Protected from political pressure. But they're not protected from intellectual influence. The economists running central banks went to the same universities as think tank researchers. They attend the same conferences. They read the same reports. They share the same foundational beliefs. So when a major think tank publishes research saying inflation expectations are rising, central bankers listen. When another warns interest rates must stay high to preserve credibility, policy follows. When think tanks promote digital currencies, governments start experimenting. Think tanks are the operating system of the global financial system. They define what's realistic and what's radical. They decide which risks matter and which don't. They set the boundaries of acceptable economic thought. The donor effect. And here's the invisible hand behind it all. A tech billionaire funds a digital currency research program. Suddenly, digital currency becomes a hot topic in policy circles. An energy company funds climate economics research. Suddenly, certain climate models get more attention than others. A bank funds a study on capital flows. Suddenly, deregulation narratives gain legitimacy. Donors don't have to demand specific conclusions. They just fund the researchers who already agree with them. Influence isn't about control, it's about amplification. Amplify the right voices long enough, and they become the mainstream. How this affects you. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how does this affect my life? Here's how. When think tanks argue for higher interest rates, your mortgage becomes more expensive. When they promote globalization, your job market changes. When they push austerity, your public services get cut. When they defend financial deregulation, your banking system becomes less stable. These aren't abstract policy debates. These are decisions that determine whether you can afford a home, retire comfortably, or pay your bills. And you never got a vote. The invisible empire. The most powerful think tanks aren't the ones on TV, the ones you've never heard of, the ones producing classified briefings for intelligence agencies, the ones quietly funded by multinational corporations, the ones drafting papers that become G7 policy, the ones embedded in the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank for International Settlements. They don't need publicity. Their power is behind the curtain. So here's what you need to understand. The world isn't shaped by elections. It's not shaped by left versus right. It's not even shaped by the leaders you see on TV. The world is shaped by ideas. And ideas are manufactured, tested, refined, and distributed by institutions you never elected. Think tanks are the factories where your economic reality gets built. If you want to understand how money really works and how to protect yourself, you need to understand the machinery behind the official story. Because the decisions about your financial future aren't just made in government buildings, they're made in the invisible architecture beneath them. History doesn't repeat itself, but the frameworks that shape history do. And if you don't know who writes those frameworks, you'll spend your whole life reacting to a world you never understood. If this opened your eyes to how the system really works, do me a favor, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Because here at Monetary Archaeologist, we dig deeper than the headlines. We follow the money to places most people never look, and we give you the tools to see the financial world as it really is, not as they want you to believe. The answers are buried in history, and I'll keep digging until we find them. I'll see you in the next one.